Welcome everyone to this webinar about the planning and holding of elections during a pandemic. I'm Magnus. I'm with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES. We're a non-profit, non-governmental organization that supports electoral processes broadly defined around the globe. And we have been supporting elections in Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm the IFES Senior Political Finance Advisor, but also Director of the Regional Europe Office, which is based in Prague, which is where I am in lockdown. And we are hosting this webinar. Our programming and this webinar is kindly funded by the US Agency for International Development, USAID. We're very grateful for that. A number of elections in European countries have been postponed due to the COVID-19 situation, and others are coming up quickly. There's little doubt that any election that's held this year, quite possibly also next year, will be held in a situation where the virus has not yet gone away, at least not completely. That presents significant challenges for us working with elections, planning and administering elections. And we need to discuss how to meet these challenges. This webinar is not about what has happened. It is about what is going to happen. When elections that have been postponed are put back on the calendar, as is the case in Serbia, for example, or when scheduled elections are starting to get fairly close. There are many European countries where we have elections scheduled for the autumn. We need to discuss together how best to prepare to meet these challenges. So with us in this webinar, we have prominent experts on various areas of elections. We have experts from among my colleagues at IFES, from election management bodies, and from civil society organizations in Europe. To give you a brief rundown, first will be Beata Martin-Rozumilowicz, who is the IFES Europe and Eurasia Regional Director. After here, we will hear from Admir Shabani, who is the head of the sector for continuous training, public outreach, and international collaboration at the State Election Commission in North Macedonia. The next speaker will be Serhii Postivy, who is a commissioner, a member of the Central Election Commission in Ukraine. We will then listen to Karine Grigoryan, President and Executive Director of the Agate Rights Defense Center for Women with Disabilities in Armenia. We will hear reflections from Rashtu Kuchel, Executive Director at the civil society organization Memo 98 in Slovakia. After that, we will open for questions, answers, comments, and a discussion. And we will end with a concluding presentation by my colleague Staffan Darnolf, who is the IFES Senior Global Electoral Operations and Administration Advisor. If you have any questions or comments during this session, because we are at this point 133 people in the webinar, we ask that you use the chat function that Nicoletta mentioned to give us your input. But at this point, I wish to hand over to Beata Martin-Rozumilowicz for her keynote address. Beata.
Thank you very much, Magnus, and I hope everyone can hear me well. If there is any disruption in my audio, we do have a taped version of my introduction, but hopefully this will be stable enough for me to be able to speak. So first of all, I wanted to wish a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to those who are joining us today, and to really thank you and welcome you to joining this IFES webinar, which we hope is the first in a series that we anticipate in the coming months on a variety of topics. My name is Beata Martin-Rozumilowicz. I'm the Director for Europe and Eurasia at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, in DC. And we are an organization that really focuses on election and democratic integrity around the world in various contexts, providing technical assistance primarily to election commissions, but also in concert with other stakeholders, civil society organizations, sometimes political parties, different state agencies, in order to achieve the goal of elections which are inclusive, integral for everyone, and widening the participation of citizens around the world. In light of the recent pandemic, which is now a global phenomenon, in fact, affecting all of our lives, IFES has launched a new series of briefing papers on this issue of what COVID-19 and the current pandemic means to elections and democracy with integrity. And we have a number of white paper briefings which are coming out, the first of which we'll discuss in more detail today, and that's really how to hold elections in a global pandemic environment. But further themes that we're going to be covering include in this current crisis in terms of political transitions that are often embedded in democratic laws and constitutions, but which are silent on such issues of crisis in a health context. We'll talk about the erosion of information currently going on in terms of viral misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. We'll be looking at barriers to political access, especially for marginalized groups because of their gender, disability, age, displacement, ethnicity, or other identifiers, and looking at the challenges that they face. We'll be looking at the explosion in technology reliance and the way in which this is being utilized within democratic electoral processes that can open up new vulnerabilities for manipulation or system failure, and whether they are further eroding trust in electoral processes. We'll focus on abuses of public sector trust and resources, and this is something that IFES has become known for within its resources framework around the world. And we'll also be looking explicitly at the decline in transparency and accountability, and what the global pandemic means for governments, particularly those that are already backsliding away from democratic processes and in the direction of authoritarianism, and how emergency powers are being used to curtail political rights or to limit information in a way which has serious implications for the long-term resilience of democracy. So these are all interesting themes which you can expect to be upcoming from IFES as an organization, and we will discuss hopefully within this Europe framework. But today's discussion will focus primarily, as Magnus said, on how countries in Europe are administering elections during the COVID-19 crisis. And I'm very happy that we have such a distinguished panel of global experts to discuss this theme, including the author of the first briefing that I mentioned. The situation across Europe and Eurasia has been developing quite dynamically. As we know, a number of different countries have had to postpone their elections for the spring, which they were anticipating. And now many of those countries are looking to potentially reschedule those elections for the summer. And these include countries like Armenia, the Czech Republic, Poland, North Macedonia, Romania, and Serbia, which has recently rescheduled its elections for the 21st of June. But as many experts have noted, the pandemic is very unlikely to end in the near term, and it's also highly unlikely that a truly safe environment will pertain until a vaccine is discovered and propagated. So what this means is that state authorities, as well as election commissions, will really have to make a careful balance between public health concerns on the one side and the importance of electoral processes on the other side. It also raises key issues of if and how election administrators can prepare and hold elections safely during an ongoing pandemic. And we already have a number of examples to look to, the elections ago, those in South Korea. And as countries reschedule those elections for the summer, more examples will come to light, and hopefully some good practices will start to emerge of how to protect citizens best in an environment which is difficult in terms of public safety. I'm also very pleased that IFES has pioneered moving much of its activities in the region into the online space. And this Zoom event, which as Magnus mentioned has more than 120 participants, is being translated into a variety of regional languages to enable wider participation. And this is the first time that we're experimenting with this wide translation in terms of an online webinar. So we very much hope that it works well for everyone that's participating. We understand that there will probably be some teething problems, but we very much look forward to driving this process and trying to find solutions that will mean that we can be increasingly connected and have meaningful dialogues in a difficult situation where most of us are still in a lockdown situation. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for their participation, for joining this morning afternoon. And I wish all of you a very thought-provoking and vibrant discussion. And we at IFES look forward to continuing to being involved in this space and continuing to do work in the world that makes a difference in terms of election integrity, even in such difficult times as a global pandemic. Thank you all for your attention, and back over to you, Magnus.
Thank you very much, Beata. And one of the countries that Beata mentioned having been caught up in this current situation is North Macedonia. And we are then especially happy to have Admir Shabani with us from the State Election Commission in North Macedonia, who will talk to us about the situation there and what they are doing in relation to this. So, Mr. Shabani, please. You're still muted.
Unmute. Is it okay now?
Yep.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity that you are giving to us to share our experience for organizing election during this period of pandemic situation. And of course, not only for election, but in every segment of life, it's not easy at all to continue with our regular activities. But however, State Election Commission, in fact, North Macedonia as a state is cut in the middle, according to the election, cut in the middle in organizing this preterm parliamentary election, because we started to organize those elections in a normal occasion in the period when everything was normally, everything was functioning as it should be. We started organizing election somewhere in the beginning of February with all the necessary activities as they are completing the electoral bodies as EBs and municipal election commissions. We started with training process. The first time in our history we did attempt to train all the electoral body members, which are approximately 35,000, and we almost done, but the situation of COVID stopped us in our intention. What is the situation that we are now in the moment? We have still a state of emergency which is forbidding us doing a lot of activities, having in mind that we could not we are still working in shifts. We are not in a full capacity. On other hand, there is a political situation which requires full capacity of work, and this is a little bit tough situation for us here. However, we have to continue, and continuing all the processes is requiring safety, first of all, for the employees of State Election Commission, for the members of electoral organs, and for each participant in electoral process. Now we are waiting decrees from the government that will clarify all this situation, and that will give us an opportunity to do to arrange our documentation and our procedures according to those new rules for protecting the health of the citizen. However, it depends on the political decision here, because the situation in North Macedonia, according to announcing the continuing of election, is depending on the government, and we still have it's not clarifying as it should be, because there is a gap in constitution of North Macedonia, and we have, to be honest, we have a problem to find and to know who have competencies to announce the election date. This situation is left to political parties, to political party leaders, who will try to find an agreement and to set the day for the election. If we have in consideration that all the election activities were postponed by a decree of the government, and after that State Election Commission set their own conclusion of stopping all these activities, we then have a situation that this must be solved by another decree that will let us to continue with our activities, which decree should be brought by the government during the state of emergency as it is now. If this decree is not brought by government, then we will be in a very, very tough situation, because there is not going to be another institution who is going to be able and who has competencies to bring some decision for the election. There are a lot of questions when we talk about election during the pandemic situation, and the main question, as it's considering to me, is the turnout of the voters. So maybe this is a great opportunity to share the ideas how that situation is going to be solved, because the turnout of the voters gives, to be honest, gives the legitimacy of election. Because if we have election with low turnout, then everyone will doubt about the legitimacy of this. What State Election Commission will do when we'll have a clear date, when we will have already announced the date of election, we will start, we will continue with the training process of electoral board members, because that's going to be maybe the most necessary thing to do in that moment because of the changing of the procedures. However, there is a protocol from the Health Commission here which requires a lot of other activities, despite the activities that they are mentioned in the electoral code. So we have to focus on that field. We have to start over the training processes. Once again, there are almost 35,000 people which are engaged to electoral bodies. This is the thing that we must do. Once again, we have to change all the procedures. We have to adopt the procedures according to this health protocol for health from this health commission. And that's why I'm saying that we should start over with training processes. The other thing that we as an institution should focus is the campaign for increasing the number of voters to go out and vote. I'm talking about turnout here. And also informing them about the protocol of vote, new protocol of voting, which will include all this required steps for saving their health during the voting process. It is going to be a huge work. It's going to be a huge activity to tell people that they first of all they're supposed to vote because that is their own right. And second, we have to show them that and to ensure them that we took all the necessary steps to not to expose them in the danger. The situation now for now is that this Commission of Health is still working on this protocol, which is going to be a general protocol, and after that, State Election Commission should adopt all those general rules and specific one according to election. This is the situation now. For now, we are in all-time meetings with other institutions. We are with all-time, we are staying connected with all the electoral infiltrated institutions and political parties and other institutions of the state. Just to get out of this situation, to have appropriate election, and to ensure every voters, every member of electoral bodies that the process should be done. The processes must continuing, but to ensure them that their health is in the first place. Because of this conclusion of decree of the government and the conclusion of State Election Commission, we are doubting now from where to start. Should we start in the point that we left? And we left in the point of signing and confirming the data on the electoral list, or to once again to do a check of the electoral list, of some other procedures what are required by electoral code of North Macedonia. That's going to be a political decision, but I must say that we're trying to be as much as possible ready in all this situation. I'm telling this because there is a change on there are changes on dates which are changes reflecting in which changes reflecting also in the sorry in the electoral list. According to electoral law of North Macedonia, the part of electoral list or the right of vote has each citizen who is 18 years old till the day for election, who has capacitas agendi and who has address in some municipality, town, village in North Macedonia. In this case, we had a date for election which was 12th of April. 12th of April is long time past, long time ago. Now when we will have another date, that will mean that the citizens of North Macedonia who are 18 years old till the new date should also have right to vote. What will happen and why we will be in not so kind and not so good situation is because that there are certain of activities that State Election Commission should take according to electoral code I'm talking to organize all this, to set all the data, to arrange the electoral list, which are a lot of dates. And then it's simply impossible. It's my personal opinion. It's simply impossible to continue in the point that we left. It's not only the electoral list. It's there are a lot of other procedures, as it is the new possible candidates and so on and so on. And here also is the diaspora voting. Because also they should have a right to vote. I'm talking about the persons who meanwhile are 18 years old. This is the difficulties that State Election Commission as an institution is facing right now, and the difficulties that will appear in the future, in the near future, when the election are announced. But however, the date will depend on the political will of political party leaders. This is from my side now for now. Thank you very much. I will be here and listen and eventually wait for the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabani. Clearly a lot of issues to be addressed, and I'm looking forward to the questions and comments session that we will have later on in the webinar. So if you do have questions, please make sure that you are remembering those. At this point, I will hand the word over to Mr. Postivy, who is a member of the Central Election Commission in Ukraine. Please note that Mr. Postivy will be making his presentation in Ukrainian. So you can, as you prefer, either switch your audio to hear his original presentation. Unfortunately, Zoom does not have a language button for Ukrainian. At this point, you would have to select Russian. If you want, you can also switch to English to hear the interpretation, but you can also stay on the language setting that you have for now. We have a second interpreter from Ukrainian who will be typing in what Mr. Postivy is saying so that the respective interpreters can provide the information in each language. So, Mr. Postivy, please, I hand you the floor.
Я приєднуюсь I join this discussion by first saying thank you for giving provided me with the possibility to participate in your webinar for Ukraine as a country that is planning holding the election in the near future. That is a very important topic, and we are doing our job in preparing for the election. I would like to tell you about Ukraine, where the Central Election Commission of Ukraine is in terms of preparation for the electoral process. If you do not object, I would like to share my presentation with you. I think it would be better for you to receive this visual presentation of information. Can you see this presentation?
David.
Okay, thank you. Now, with regard to Ukraine, for us, the question is not whether we are going to postpone our election to the other date, because for Ukraine, this question is rather regulated by the constitutional provisions. As you could see, there are articles of constitution that state that regular elections of members of the Verkhovna Rada, Parliament of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, village, settlement, city, Ryan and Oblast councils and village, settlement, city mayors shall be held on the last Sunday of October of the 5th year of office. According to this provision, regular local elections are to take place on October 25th in Ukraine. And the question whether to hold election or not to hold election, this is the question which we do not have, since the legislation clearly defines cases when the election must not be held. Elections shall be prohibited in case of the introduction of martial law. As of today, we have quarantine established in the entire territory of Ukraine, which does not serve the ground for postponing or canceling the election. If we talk about legal changes, we would need to have amendments to the Constitution and to the legislation, to the Constitution, and the procedure to amend the Constitution is quite lengthy and time-consuming, and if our parliament starts the process to amend the constitution, the process would take a long time, which would be hardly possible to complete prior to the tentative date, scheduled date of the local election. So all in all relevant stakeholders understand that the election will take place as scheduled last Sunday of October. With regard to the pandemic situation, we are fully aware that the pandemic means introducing new methods, new procedures, introducing new innovative technologies in the electoral process is one of the key priorities in the work of the Central Election Commission. At the same time, we are taking a very prudent and cautious approach to introduction of the latest technologies, as the issue of public trust in the electoral process is the key priority for the Central Election Commission. The remote voting by post or the internet, which is actively discussed in many countries as an alternative solution, is not an option for the Central Election Commission for the forthcoming 2020 local elections, as we see a lot of risks associated with the introduction of such technologies. As of today, we see see that we lack legal regulation on the use of such technologies other than the procedures set out in our legislation. In addition to it, we have a limited time frame for testing and implementation. We need to have approval and also conclusion of the state expertise prior to introducing such technologies, and we've got a very short time. Also, we miss time due time to conduct a vote information campaign to inform voters about new voting methods. We take a lesson learned approach from the experience of other countries that we have, for example, in Poland, recent changes were made with regard to the methods of voting, as well as confrontation between the government and the opposition with regard to restriction of the rights of voters. Also, the goal to ensure free and fair election would be difficult to achieve with the help of voting through the internet. All in all, as of today, we cannot guarantee to our voters that while introducing new technologies, we would ensure protection of the entire process and the security of the entire process, and the voter would not have sufficient trust in it and sufficient grounds to believe that the vote cast by them would be taken in correctly. Also, we might expect failures in access to the voting system. We should take into account experience of the United States, in particular state of Wisconsin, where a decision was made to change the voting methods and to hold election during the pandemic, while they failed to form election commission and failed to provide an access to voters to the voting system, taking into account a series of those severe threats, while we are tackling the challenge of preparing for the local election planned for October 2020. We have no other way but carry on with the traditional method of voting. Nevertheless, I would like to share with you that recently Ukraine did have some experience of holding elections during the pandemic. On March 15th, 2020, we have had the by-election of a member of parliament in a single mandate district in Kharkiv region, and this by-election was held during the pandemic. In relation to that, the Central Election Commission responded to the global challenges, to the challenges brought to us by a pandemic, and we have made the resolution on measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19 during the organization and conduct of the said by-election. We provided for a series of measures. In particular, we emphasized the need to strictly follow the recommendations of our health ministry. There were specific requirements established for the election commission members, as well as for local administrations that had to provide a number of steps to provide the election commission members with means of protection. In particular, we obliged the local administrations to assist election commission members with equipping them with equipment to measure temperature, body temperature. In the same way, we ensured the conduct of the by-election in the condition of due distance of 2 meters between voters. Should a lot of people come to polling station at the same time, measures were taken to separate the voters and to make sure they follow the rule of a distance of no less than 2 meters. Following the results of the by-election that were held, we observed the dramatic decrease of the voter turnout compared to the turnout was 27.5%, whereas during during the election held in normal condition, the voter turnout in that particular region was 51%. The turnout decreased by 50%. At the same time, there was no incident reported as of the time of holding the by-election in that region of any patient infected with the COVID-19. Now, what the Central Election Commission is planning to do next? As a matter of fact, we are taking a very prudent and responsible approach toward the question of preparation for the election. We received, thanks to the assistance of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the report on holding elections in South Korea. As of today, we are studying this report. We are fully aware of the challenges we are faced with, and our job is to ensure the organization and conduct of the election. We have to take a new approach to the organization of the electoral process. In particular, in the field of training, we jointly with our international partners are examining the question of possibility of developing video training materials and holding training in the mode of online video conferencing. So we are starting different approaches how we can organize the training for our election commission members as well as voters who should be able to receive information materials from us from accessible sources using their smartphones, tablets, or computers. In the same way like you, we are working on new requirements for campaigning. As I have mentioned, during the recent by-election in the Kharkiv region, we have paid attention of our candidates to the requirement to comply with the safe distance rule. The same rule should be applied during the period of campaigning. We are also aware that the political parties are also considering for themselves different methods of campaigning, safe methods of campaigning using social media, social networks, online methods of work with voters. With regard to organization of our work, we are planning to work hard on ensuring individual safety of election commission members. With regard to this question, of course, we expect that we should have a joint decision between the CEC, the Central Election Commission, the government, and the parliament, as equipping election commission members with additional means of protection that were never planned and budgeted and never used. Now we have a question to solve: how to equip the election commission members with such measures of individual protection. And in terms of funding, we have a question as one of their questions for us, how we are going to organize the election with the due consideration of the need to ensure safety and finance those expenditures. Recently, in Ukraine, about 40 national legal instruments were adopted by different state bodies with the aim to prevent the spread of COVID-19. About 40 legal instruments were adopted by the parliament, the government, and other state bodies. As as part of preparation for the election, we are going to develop separate recommendations based on the study of the best practices from other countries, best international practices. I have also received a couple of questions from the participants of our webinar today with regard to the following. In Ukraine, indeed, we have reduced by almost by half the budget for holding the local election. On the one hand, that is a true challenge for the Central Election Commission. We, as the Central Election Commission, have addressed the Parliament, setting out in writing all threats. That is a 16-page document laying out all threats that we are going to be faced with should we lack proper funding. And we received a response from the government that the budget for holding the local elections will be revised. At the same time, we understand that against the backdrop of the pandemic and the global challenges, the government had to revise the budget. As of today in Ukraine, according to the information that we have, Ukraine has full control over the COVID-19, and due to that, the budget may be revised. At the same time, we should consider we may involve international organizations, our partners, to work with us, especially in the field of training. We are developing the chatbot, video materials for training. We are planning to involve our international partners, and we are also thinking together with them on developing the safe as possible training materials and tools for our work. Thank you for your attention. I would be happy to answer your questions and look forward to our continued discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Postivy, for your presentation and also for responding to some of the questions that have been sent to us in advance, specifically for this webinar. So thank you very much for that. We will continue now in English, so everyone can switch to your preferred language setting if you're not already there. We next welcome Karine Grigoryan, who is the Executive Director of the Agate Rights Defense Center for Women with Disabilities in Armenia, who will talk to us about the importance of inclusion in the renewed electoral processes that we are facing at the moment. So, Karine, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank all organizers for this important webinar and all presenters for your presentation. If you don't mind, I'm going to share with you my presentation. Okay. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so my name is Karine Grigoryan. I am the president of Agate Rights Defense Center for Women with Disabilities in Armenia. Our organization has a lot of work to promote inclusion and accessibility of elections in Armenia, and we work closely with IFES Armenia and Central Electoral Commission in Armenia. So why we should consider and ensure participation of persons with disabilities in elections, because over than 1 billion people over the world have disabilities. When we are talking about democracy, it is very important to understand the importance of inclusion. Inclusion not only persons with disabilities, but also inclusion of women, youth, elderly people, immigrants, and everyone. So, right of political participation is guaranteed within different international human rights mechanisms and also national legislation. So I'm sure all of your countries ratified UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and also in 2016, about 8 recommendations were developed by OSCE and ODIHR to ensure political participation of persons with disabilities. So, when we talk about inclusion of persons with disabilities in elections, we should consider that persons with disabilities can be not only voters, they can also be poll workers, election and administration bodies, they can be candidates, members of political parties. So inclusion should be ensured in all phases of election. If we are planning our elections in a way that are inclusive and accessible for persons with disabilities, it can be beneficial also to voters with temporary injuries, immigrants, elderly people, and also for people who have low literacy skills. So, if we talk about COVID-19 and its current situation, we know that most of persons with disabilities have more health-related issues and they have poor health. And also persons with disabilities, most of them have poor immune system. So it is important to understand that they are more vulnerable to get COVID-19 than people without disabilities. So when we are planning elections, in order to be effective, I recommend all of you to cooperate with disabled persons organizations in your countries, because they are the experts in the field and they can help you to work more effectively on inclusion. And it is very important to work especially with cross-disability coalitions, because they involve persons with different types of disabilities. And as you know, different types of disabilities, they require different accessibility measures. So I strongly recommend you to work with coalitions of disabled persons in your countries. And also, it is very important to consider not only persons with disabilities in the capital, but I strongly encourage you to reach out persons with disabilities in regions of your countries, because they have different needs. So as you talked as you talk, some countries are going to have elections in the near future. So my first recommendation, besides ensuring all necessary hygienic measures, also it is important to ensure full accessibility of polling stations, also availability of magnifying glasses, accessible voting booths for people with disabilities who use wheelchair, and tactile ballot boxes, because as we know, if we don't ensure persons with disabilities to vote independently, they have to require some assistance, and being in contact with other persons make them more vulnerable to get COVID-19. So it is very important to make sure you ensure accessibility. Also, my recommendations to CSC, when you accredit observers, also I encourage to accredit observers with disabilities. And it is very important also to pay attention on the layout of polling stations, because most often, like polling stations are layouts make it not accessible for persons who use wheelchair and other assistive devices to move independently and to vote secretly. So long-term recommendation, like for those countries who are going to have their election postponed for next year, we already talked. Some countries are considering developing like online voting processes or by posting. It is very important when you are thinking to develop innovative technologies to ensure online voting processes. Just from the beginning, I encourage you to collaborate with persons with disabilities and test with them, or if those innovative technologies for voting are accessible for them. Also, it is very important to make CEC website accessible for persons with all types of disabilities, including visual, psychosocial, and intellectual disabilities. Those countries who have time, I encourage to revise your election law to see if it complies with CRPD laws. And when you organize civic or voter education, it should be in accessible formats. After this slide, I'm going to show you a table of accessibility formats for voters with different types of disabilities. Also, budget for reasonable accommodations, which includes also sign language interpretation of educational materials, and the way you are organizing trainings for poll workers, it is very important to include disability voter administrating in poll workers' manual. So in this table, you can see different accessibility format examples for persons with different types of disabilities, which includes audio version for blind people, braille, captioning for deaf people and who have hearing disabilities, easy to read for people with intellectual disabilities and non-native speakers. Large print, you can also use pictures for those who have intellectual disabilities, sign language and titles. And during this stage, many of you are organizing your meetings online, and I strongly encourage you to use Zoom and Skype platforms because they are most accessible for persons with different types of disabilities. Because, like for example, you can change the light and dark mode, you can change sizes of fonts, and even you can ensure sign language interpretation during this online meetings. Thank you very much. I should be happy to answer your question.
Thank you very much, Karine. And I have already some questions that we received for you, but we will wait with those until the Q&A session. So at this point, I will ask Rastio Kuchel from Memo 98 in Slovakia to make some reflections. And I do apologize for saying this, but I am a little bit mindful of the time. We are a little bit behind schedule. So if you are concise, Mr. Kuchel, that will be superb. Rastio, please.
Well, thank you very much, Magnus. I understand that I'm the last speaker before the Q&A session, so I will indeed try to be very short and hopefully concise. I should say that many of the points that I really wanted to touch upon were already covered by the previous speakers, so hopefully this will make my job easier. But let me start also the same way as Karine and thank IFES for organizing this event. I think it's really a very topical webinar. I actually remember that 2 months ago we were organizing a webinar together with IFES after the elections in Slovakia. And I should really say that that IFES has really progressed a lot, and I see that 140 participants in today's webinar. I think really you deserve a big gratitude for this organization. So I should also say that it was my honor to work with Beata on this white paper, how to maintain integrity of elections during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this briefing, we try to cover some of these issues which basically we are discussing today. Basically, postpone or not to postpone elections, which is almost a Hamletian question. Our health versus the health of our democracies. Is it actually possible to find the balance between these two and all organize the elections? So what are the implications? I think first of all, we should realize that there were problems with our democracies and elections prior to the COVID-19, and these problems just did not go away. In fact, some of them may have grown even bigger. So on one side, we have disinformation, we have the war of narratives, we have the blame game, who is responsible for the virus, or who is more efficient in coping with the situation. On the other side, we have obviously, the tendencies, if we postpone, does it mean that, that again, the health of our democracy could get worse, So, these are some of the considerations which are relevant to ask. Now, as I mentioned, previous speakers mentioned some of the risks which are associated with organizing elections under the current circumstances. So I would start by putting above all these consideration is obviously the safety and health related considerations. And we see, for example, from the case in Wisconsin that, despite the fact that there were some measures taken, there were still people who were infected. So I think the health goes about everything else. The second question already mentioned by Admir is the question of legitimacy. So, do we have, can we say that we have legitimate elections if, for example, we have low turnout? And I think this was demonstrated during the first round of the French elections, French local elections, where the turnout was really much lower in comparison with the elections 4 years ago. And that's the reason why France eventually decided to postpone the second round of elections, because the legitimacy of any government which comes out of elections which has a very low turnout is really in question. Third, and very important, was just mentioned by Karine, which is basically inclusion. Elections belong to all people, and we should ensure that we do not disenfranchise important parts of society. And so this would, first of all, would go, to seniors who are the most vulnerable group affected by the virus. But this goes also, further in making sure that people with disabilities are actually able to participate, and also for example, those who are already infected by the virus should be able to participate, as we were able to see, for example, in the case of South Korea, which actually did provide for those who are infected to vote. This was done after the voting took place, and then they were able to vote in some specially organized polling stations. So I think inclusion is another very important thing on the list. Another one is obviously respect for fundamental freedoms. So obviously we are talking about right of assembly, which is limited under the current circumstances. We are talking about freedom of expression, which is obviously limited, and it was already mentioned by the previous speakers, particularly Serhii. If there is no ample information, if it's not possible to make sure that that people can actually make fully informed choices, which I think is extremely important. Obviously, another crucially important factor in any election is the question of trust. So I would fully agree that rushing to implement or to introduce new tools, such as the case of rushing now to introducing internet voting, or maybe not introducing something completely new, but changing the system shortly before elections, like there were these attempts made in Poland that they wanted to replace the normal vote with the postal vote. I think this is also something which really requires, societal discussion, which requires, careful considerations. At the end of this process, there needs to be trust. people need to trust the system. They need to trust, you know, those who are organizing elections. In this case, obviously, election management bodies. That all of these considerations were taken were factored in, and then they could really trust the result. And there are no questions about this. Obviously, along this goes the ability to observe, which also is a very important thing. Nowadays, you know, huge majority of elections are observed by international and domestic observers. And if this observation is not possible, then again, there could be questions about legitimacy of elections. So these all really are important issues which should be taken into consideration. Obviously, if we are changing the rules of game just shortly before elections, we are also creating confusion. So this is another thing that has to be considered. You know, if we want to, you know, if we want to go ahead and organize the elections, it is something that has to be taken into consideration. There needs to be a very clear plan, which is clearly explained to everyone. And then there are no confusion, as again, I think the case of Poland is very good for this type of demonstration. So maybe to wrap up, you know, we should basically recognize that there was a significant erosion of trust prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, and possibly, you know, as we are fighting, you know, to survive, as we are fighting to defeat this virus, maybe we could offer a second opportunity to our leaders to prove that they can be trusted. But in order to do that, we should not rush to introducing changes or introducing new tools. I think for this, it is important that, that there is societal discussion, you know, that it is inclusive process. And everyone, basically all relevant stakeholders are actually included in this process. And obviously, you know, as this webinar is for election management bodies, we should also realize that if you decide not to postpone elections, and if you decide to go ahead and conduct the elections, you will have to do that with your current capabilities, you know, including financial, human resources. And we also should recognize that this is not a normal situation. I mean, this is a situation which does require some crisis, you know, some elements which are there during crisis situations. So I think we need to have a clear command structure, approval process, clear division of responsibilities to avoid contradictions. The worst of all is create some panic, you know, prior to the elections, and then people not understanding, you know, what are the rules and what they are supposed to do. So involvement of all relevant stakeholders, ensuring proper cooperation, communication, clear communication strategy, you know, including both legacy and social media, to prevent this type of panic and make sure that people will actually prefer the hard facts over disinformation. So I think with this, perhaps I will stop, and you know, we'll be more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rastio. These were very important points, and I completely agree about, among other things, not rushing into solutions and to engage actors as much as possible in the dialogue. And I think to some extent, the lockdown can help us in the dialogue because we're all sitting at home. We need to remember that this is our opportunity to reach out. So thank you very much, Rastio. Thanks you to all the speakers so far. I'm going to open the floor for your questions and comments. So as we mentioned in the beginning, please use the chat function, you see that at the bottom of your screen, to type in comments that or questions that you have to the speakers. If your question is for a specific speaker, please make sure that you note who that is. So while you are considering and typing in, I read out one of the questions we have received so far, and that is a question to Karine in particular. It mentions that due to COVID-19, some election management bodies are reluctant to hire elderly people as poll workers due to their them being at heightened risk of falling ill. Would this same rationale be valid for persons with disabilities? And what does that mean for inclusiveness in the electoral administration? And what can EMBs do to overcome such risks? Karine.
Na telefon od kontrola, kako ste dobri, izvini, vakar preko telefon. Ima jedan predmet iz tega od skupštine Zagate. Ako može na...
Karine, please.
As I mentioned, it is very important to consider the need for persons with all types of disabilities, because all of that disability is diverse, and it is important to understand that physical disabilities requires other accessibility measures, hard of hearing. So I mentioned it is important to collaborate with disabled persons organizations and involve them in election administration process, because they are the experts. They can give good advice depending on the situation of the particular country. So my advice is to collaborate from the beginning, to collaborate with persons with disabilities and consider accessibility provision for everyone.
Thank you very much for that answer, Karine. We have received one question from Mr. Postivy. So if we could please have that interpreted for him. This is from Johanna Layson. It's asking, and I'm reading this out, with the small delays between any new procedures and process to implement before election day, what learning strategies is the CEC considering? And are you considering e-learning solutions to support these learning activities?
Да, однозначно мы рассматриваем.
Clearly, we are considering e-learning solutions, and actually tomorrow we are going to hold a meeting of the working group of our colleagues at the Central Election Commission, where we are going to introduce the concept and the ideas of the chatbot and the educational platform, as well as materials for online training and the courses for election commission members. Indeed, we have developed some materials and some concept notes. Tomorrow we are going to present them to the election commission members for decision making.
Thank you very much, Mr. Postivy, for that answer. I have received two questions that relate to election observation. And this is not a question to any specific speaker, but I would like to pose this question that's come from several places and see who wants to say something. So one question is, what is the role of election observers and observer organizations in relation to elections held during a pandemic? And the question is on relation to domestic observers, what are they thinking in order to move forward with election observation during the current situation? So I'll just open that question up generally, and we'll be very interested to see who would like to give an answer. And you can either just type in an answer into the chat function or give us your own. And I see that Rastio is already virtually raising his hand. Thank you very much for Rastio. What your response?
Well, it's a very good question, and I did mention that also during my presentation. You know, if we consider now both domestic and international observation as a standard part of elections, adding important components, particularly related to legitimacy of the process, I think it is quite natural that we ask this question. Now, I think you know, the answer obviously would be very sort of specific vis-a-vis the actual situation in the country. But I think the same way as we try to ensure that there are conditions for organizing elections, we have to simply make sure that there are conditions also for observation of elections. Now, if we see that, you know, like for example, in Estonia, it's about it's more than 40% of the vote now is already happening on internet, and so and this is primarily linked with the fact that there is trust of the society into this type of voting. Obviously, I think all election observers will have to face that question. You know, how to stay relevant in this changing environment. I mean, again, this COVID-19 situation may have brought many negative things, but perhaps there will be also some interesting challenges. And one of those will be really discussing these type of questions. I mean, to what extent we want to move to an online environment. And then in relation to that, this is a relevant question then for the election observers, how to ensure that they stay relevant, you know, how to ensure that they are still, you know, contributing to the process. But I think, you know, to maybe give a more clear or straightforward question or response is basically it's a very important part of the election process, and we should not really proceed in organizing elections unless we can also make sure that election observation is included.
Thank you very much, Rastio. In the interest of time, I will round up the Q&A session with two questions that have come in for Mr. Shabani. The first question is whether the State Election Commission is a formal member of the Public Health Commission, or if it is, as it were, a recipient of the decisions by the Public Health Commission. And the other question is similar to what was asked to Mr. Postivy, in what are the learning strategies that the State Election Commission are considering to get the information out to those working in election administration at all levels. So, Mr. Shabani, if you could please give us fairly brief answers to those questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. First, State Election Commission is not an official member of Commission of Health. We are collaborating with them. In fact, in this moment, we are waiting for their protocol of health. And as I mentioned before, that protocol we will adopt in our own documents. Once again, State Election Commission is not a member. We are collaborating, we are having consultancy with them just to find appropriate way to save the health of the citizen in this process. That will be the answer of the first question. The second question was about the training, as I understand, about providing the information to the citizens, to the voters, to the electoral board members. Let's go step by step. State Election Commission has a pool of trainers which contains 93 certificated trainers for elections. In this moment, a lot of participants in this webinar are typically for this pool of trainers. There are a lot of people who are participating now in this webinar, and I salute them. They are the best. We did the emergency plan in the first moment that the election were postponed, because we thought that for 2 weeks we will start again with our process. It didn't happen, and now we are doing emergency plans for the next period. That plan probably, because it just a draft version, and we should also adopt that plan with this protocol also. But however, those 93 certificated trainers, they will be set in more than 40 teams, which will provide trainings in the field. Probably 2 trainings a day, and 1 training is around 3.5 hours. And in that case, for 15 till 20 days, we will cover all the electoral board members with standard procedures of voting, and a part and a specific topic with this new versions, new protocols on the voting procedure. That is as it's considered to the electoral board members. For the citizens, State Election Commission is already preparing the campaign, which will also contains all these protocols for saving their health, wearing masks during the voting, wearing gloves, and probably there will be some other steps, not in the voting, but probably in when they are approaching to the polling station, there will be some other steps to guarantee them and the others around them that they are all protected. This will be the steps that we are started to work, and we will finish till the moment that election will be announced, and till the election day. Also, the campaign will contain every single step for the saving their health. We are changed now the strategy of informing the citizens, because we had totally different approach to them. Now we will try to avoid as much as possible not social distancing, I prefer to say the physical distancing, just to avoid any infection. There are a lot of ideas, there are a lot of proposals, but now for now we are looking to those that I mentioned. I wouldn't be surprised if in the last minute we change something else, but in a positive way, because that is the situation, and requires sometimes a minute to 12 to change strategy. Thank you. I think this is the answer of the question. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Shabani. And our concluding speaker for this webinar will be my colleague Staffan Darnolf from IFES, to talk about practical approaches to administering elections in the COVID-19 pandemic. Staffan, if I can ask you to be as very concise as you can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invite here. So what I'm gonna see if I can actually, I knew I was gonna be the last one. I'm gonna share a PowerPoint that is the shorter version, since I know we were running a bit out of time here. So let me just do So my name is Staffan Darnolf. As Magnus said, I'm with IFES, and what I'm going to talk about right now is based on a paper that I drafted with a colleague of mine, but more importantly, we did this jointly with public health experts. And I think that's sort of a bit of a new angle, how we are adopting and adjusting to the challenges for when it comes to COVID-19, that we are working much more closely with the public health sector. And we're not just you know, the regular election administration geeks are doing this, but we need to reach across the pond to the public health sector. First, I'm going to say that we don't really have any best practices yet when it comes to organizing elections under COVID-19. There's an emerging practice, and I will talk quickly about some of the good things and sort of what we are falling short when it comes to organizing elections. This table here, I think, is illustrative why we need to be mindful about COVID-19.
Staffan?
Yes?
Staffan, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you. I think the screen share isn't really working. We don't see the table at this point. If you could please end the screen share and restart it, because we really want to see the table that you're... that looks good.
Let me do this way instead, though, because I think my computer is a little bit slow. So we do it from this, because now you can see the table, right?
Yes.
Yep. I mean, this one is interesting and telling. You know, we, of course, in a lot of places, we're using still paper ballots. And as election administrators, we love forms. And the coronavirus will actually remain on the paper for 1 day. Of course, we have to have poll workers and voters coming into our buildings, so they're touching rails, they're touching the glass doors or the metal on the handle of the doors. That could remain there for 5 days. In some places, we're also using various equipment to like poll books or voter verification machines. Again, that machine can harbor the virus for up to 5 days. So that's why we are extremely exposed to the risks when we're organizing elections. So what are some of the emerging practices that we see here? Well, first of all is that normally an EMB tend to reach out to security forces, be that police, military, intelligence, as they deal with safety and security of the elections. Now we also have to include public health representatives and actually do a public health risk assessment of the electoral process, not just looking at the traditional one about risk for fraud or malpractice. And when we're doing this risk assessment, like been mentioned by some other colleagues, it's not just focusing on the public-facing parts of elections like voter registration, candidate nomination, or election day. It's equally important to look at things that's happening behind the scenes. For instance, access to your offices, your warehouses where you're packing your polling station kits, and of course the places where you do train your poll workers. All these things needs to be part of this risk assessments that you're doing. And then of course, based on this risk, you will develop a risk mitigation plan, and we've heard a lot of great examples how you're doing this. And of course, there is no blueprint, there's no one size fits all, because if I was looking at the risk mitigation plan that's used in the state of Oregon in the US, which is exclusively using postal ballot, it will look very, very different to a country where you're using primarily in-person paper-based solutions. So it needs to be tailored to the country in question. But there's certain things that we will all find there now, and that's the procurement of various forms of PPEs and cleaning products, changing procedures, and in some instances even changing the law if there's time to do that in order to reduce the risks. And all these things of procuring new materials, changing procedures, changing trainings, expanding voter education will have ramifications on your operational plan. It will force you to revise the calendar and of course the budget. There's a lot of references to South Korea, which is a good one, and I would say a unique case in point here. but they spent over $20 million just on PPEs for election on election day. That's a huge amount of money. They could afford it and they could resolve it, but that's a lot of money. So that one needs to be mindful about the solutions that being suggested and if they are indeed applicable. I just mentioned voter education. And even without the COVID-19 situation, of course, voter education is immensely important in any elections for the EMB. But this time around, you're facing two additional challenges. One is, of course, as was mentioned earlier, you need to integrate a COVID-19 message in addition to all the changes you've done when it comes to the procedures. And here I would say you have two very clear audiences. One is, of course, the voters and the parties and the candidates running for office, but equally important is your potential poll workers. What we notice in a couple of places where they've moved forward with elections is that they have immense problems with securing poll workers to do their jobs and show up for the job. I'll talk a bit about that in a different slide. But therefore, when you're doing your voter education and your strategic communication, you also need to keep in mind that you have a poll worker audience as well for this messaging. So a bit about this poll worker recruitment then. You're facing in a lot of places two challenges. First of all, you might need to recruit more poll workers than you ever used before at the same time as your regular pool of poll workers might be disappearing. And what do I mean by this? Well, in order to reduce the risks for voters on election day, you might decide to purchase the digitized digital thermometers, and you will have a person checking every individual voter before he or she enters the polling stations. You might also decide, in order to ensure safe social distancing, there will be a dedicated person that will be doing nothing but enforcing this. By doing this, you have suddenly added 2 additional slots to your polling station. And if you have 10,000 polling stations, suddenly you need to recruit 20,000 additional poll workers compared to before. And normally you might reach into the school system using a lot of teachers, but often in a lot of places they tend to reach out to the health sector, nurses and so on, that will help as poll workers. For obvious reasons, they are no longer available because they are working flat out in the day jobs to keep the nation healthy. Secondly, also, at least in a number of the European countries, the slightly elderly, the retired, tends to be a important pool of recruitment for poll workers. Based on their heightened risks, it's probably not wise to use them to be sitting full days being exposed to people with potential with COVID-19. It has been shown in research that you do 30 to 45 minutes, the risk is relatively small. But if you, over longer period of times, have been exposed to the virus, the risk of attracting it goes up significantly. So therefore, you need to be mindful of, you need to hire more people because they might not show up on election day because after all, they are nervous, they don't feel safe in spite of all your actions you've taken, but also the pool you're recruiting from might need to be altered. Then when it comes to the actual training, what we've seen to date is the trainings tend to be pretty good. They're introducing new procedures that will find its way to the manuals and into the videos. Special videos are being produced just focusing on these aspects. But it's often one component that's missing in the training, and that is proper use of the PPEs. If you go to nursing school or medical school, they will actually spend quite a bit of time training you how to properly put it on, use it, and take it off. Because if you don't do that properly, and you might not be issuing them with gloves, because that's not really feasible to be wearing gloves for all days, they might be transmitting the virus onto themselves. And that's something we don't see much attention to paid into these trainings. And also we need to keep in mind, in some places, the election authority has decided to hand out masks to voters or gloves to voters on election day. So they then need to be able to instruct the voters on how to properly put it on and properly take it off once they're done through the polling. Voter registration. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of things that could be said about this, you know, the location, the layout, the number of voters. It's fairly self-explanatory. Some of these things are based on your legal framework, if you can make changes or not. What I will focus on here is more the last point, which is actually entry and exit protocols. We've seen that they tend to be putting a lot of attention on making sure there's enough space between voters and as they queue up outside of the polling station and waiting to enter it. But during the entry and exit of the building, there tend to be choke points where people bumping into each other or being way too close to each other. A couple of simple suggestions on how one can overcome that. One is, of course, you have a dedicated entry and you have dedicated exit. In schools, you can usually figure that one out. Might not be the most convenient, but you will certainly find two different entry and exit points that can work. Secondly, you can either put a poster there, but that's sometimes people don't really look at. So sometimes you post an individual who will be guiding people and coordinating that. We see that even in the grocery stores here in the US these days. And thirdly, since you will have, you know, thousands of people touching these doors, it's immensely important that is part of the daily cleaning protocol on election day, that they will regularly and frequently clean the door handles for the entry and exit points of a polling station. There was also some talking about, especially from Poland and elsewhere, and the US certainly, when it comes to increasing postal ballots. In some places, for legal reasons, that's not feasible. My take is the following, what I see when it comes to postal ballots. You might have a postal service that's doing a reasonably good job, but we also have to be mindful that the postal service will not be performing to its full capacity, as it is also impacted by COVID-19. So if you introduce a large-scale postal service voting option on a short notice, the postal service might not be able to deliver. They will be under so much stress just to perform the normal duties, they might not be able to take on board that. And the same thing, of course, goes for your own institution, that you will be so challenged to perform your normal duties to deliver and hold elections in the polling stations, that is difficult to take on board a lot of other activities as well, on top of just tweaking the regular voting procedures. So if postal services is entered, it should often be just for a discrete subsection of the electorate, be that, if possible, you know, at the prisons or hospitals or something like that. Finally, some conclusions here, though, when it comes to when do you think you can potentially move forward with an election. There's sort of 4 factors that I tend to advise EMBs to consider. One is, of course, where are you when it comes to the disease transmission? Are you still going up? Have you sort of tamed the curve and going down? So where are you? Is it still exploding or not? Secondly is, of course, what's the capacity of the health sector? Are they already now at max capacity? And if we just move ahead with elections, and even if there is a smaller amount of people that will be affected, that it might actually bring it to a collapse or not. Thirdly and fourthly, these are sort of more things within your power and your mandate is, of course, you've done the risk assessment, you produce a mitigation plan, you made the changes to your operations, and you start doing procurement. But even so, will you be able to effectively initiate and implement all these reforms that you have sort of promised you want to do? We've seen in some cases that they have done the planning, they've started doing the procurement, but because of the shortage of masks and other material on the international market, the material that they had procured and paid for arrived too late. So only partially were they able to distribute PPEs, both to voters and to poll workers. So it is immensely important to keep in mind the strain that exists, not just on securing a contract, but actual delivery of PPEs right now because of the limitations in freight capability that exists. And I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Staffan. Those are very excellent ideas and advice about how to practically administer elections in the current pandemic situation. At this point, I will finish the webinar. I thank all the speakers for what they have been telling us and all of you for participating. I want to give a big thank you to USAID for funding and supporting this event. And a special thank you to Nicoletta Diossi at IFES for all her work in preparing for this event. She has easily spent 100 hours just preparing for this one webinar. This is a series of webinars, and the next installment will be announced, both its specific topic and its date, very soon. But until then, I thank you all again, and I wish you all to stay safe. Thank you.